Hey, Tom Bartels from growfoodwell.com, and I'm here today to show you a couple of the key tools that I use for spring gardening. The first one here is a broad fork, and this is a really great tool for spring gardening or for compacted soils or really heavy wet soils. It'll save your back. It's a very efficient tool. It's got like 10 or 11 inch tines here. They make them different sizes. And what you do with this, in my case, I have some beds out here in the back 40 that are mulched. They spent the winter out here. They were layered under the winter snows. That snow evaporated, melted out, and then we had a dry period. So I have some compaction in the beds. They're dried out, kind of compact. I'm going to be planting in a couple weeks, and rather than coming in here with my garden fork and trying to break up those dry, compacted soils, the first thing I'm going to do is come out a few weeks ahead of time and use this broad fork, and you use your whole body to press those tines down in, and then you lean back on it, and it'll break up that soil pretty readily. And then I can use it, and I'm doing this right a couple days before I know there is a rain coming, so that rain will then percolate down in there and resaturate that soil and get it ready for when I work it in a couple weeks. You can also use a hose to get some moisture in there as well. Now the odd thing is this also works for soil that's too wet. So if your soil's too wet in the spring and cold, you need it to dry out a little bit to the point where you can work it. So then in that case you would do the same thing, pushing that broad fork down in, leaning back on it, breaking that soil up, which would allow a lot of that moisture to escape and evaporate more quickly. So basically that's the whole move on a broad fork. You just use your whole body weight and kind of back your way down the garden bed. And this is the best way to prep that garden soil. It does not disrupt the microorganisms in the soil very much. It just creates a nice little break in there. But in general, this garden fork saves a lot of work later on. It breaks up that soil early, allows you to get a little bit of moisture back into it if that's the case, or if there's too much moisture, this breaking of the matted layers on top can allow some of that moisture to evaporate. So if you have heavy clay soils and a lot of compaction, you can use a broad fork to break that up in the springtime right before the rains come, and consequently the rains will be able to saturate that bed a lot more quickly. So that'll get you some soil that's much more workable by the time you're planting your seedlings. And using the broad fork is just one of the ways to keep the soil aerated and keep it healthy so that those microorganisms in the soil food web can do most of the work for you. And that's how you get gardens like this. Now these are a little more expensive than a standard garden fork, but they're well worth it, and they're a great tool to go in on with your neighbors or those other people that might be in your garden group, because you only need to use it once or twice a year. I'll put a link below the video so you can see more details on how to get them. So let's go inside and I'll show you the other great tool I use for spring gardening. So the other key tool I use for spring gardening is this little number right here. This is a countertop compost pail, and we use it a little differently than just for compost. It's got your basic vegetable scraps and stuff that you'd probably have in your own kitchen. Here's a quick shot of it. It's banana peels and old coffee grounds and eggshells and old bread and stuff like that. It's all just plant-based organic matter that's processed in your kitchen. There's two people here, my wife and I, so we generate maybe one of these every 3 days or so. And what we do with it is we put it in a worm bin outside as opposed to a compost pile. The main reason is traditional compost, like in a 4-bin system, which I do also use, is typically best used with large amounts and quantities all at once, and you turn it all at once, etc. And since we're producing small batches of vegetable waste every 3 days or so, it's a little harder to work that into a regular compost system. But luckily, worm bins work great for processing this small batch of vegetable matter every 3 or 4 days. And what happens is, and why it's really important for spring gardening, is my worms in the outdoor bin have insulation around them, so they process this kitchen waste all winter long. And I'll show you the bin in a second. But when we come around to spring planting, I've typically got about 300 pounds of worm castings in that bin that's ready for the spring gardens. And I do it all with very little work. I don't turn the pile or anything. The worms do all that for me. So not only are we removing this vegetable matter from the waste stream, we're not throwing anything away. What we're utilizing is that wonderful resource of micro and macronutrients and carbon and all this great enriched plant food that we're then processing through the worm bin. And the worm castings are actually enhanced material. It's really, really good for growing plants. So let me show you the worm bin outside. There are a lot of variations on this, but in general, this is a repurposed 1972 General Electric top-loading freezer that I cut the bottom out of, and we've been using for a worm bin for over a decade or so. You can make them out of all kinds of different receptacles, but repurposed freezers and refrigerators work great. And the reason being is that they're already pre-insulated, and you can put whatever aesthetic jacket you want on there, but the point is you want to get things composted and you want to give the worms a good environment so they can outlast the winter and keep growing. Now, what we've got in here, I'll give you a close-up of this, is a lot of active worms. And basically what worm castings turn into, they look like coffee grounds or black grape nuts, I like to use them, but here's what it turns into. It's the most incredible, enriched stuff for your garden that you can imagine. It happens for free, and you can get it yourself by just repurposing your own kitchen scraps, putting it in a worm bin, and these are red wriggler worms, and voila, you got 300 pounds each spring to spread throughout the gardens to really supercharge your seedlings each year. Now there are a lot of variables on this and different types of worm bins, and I've still got a free workshop out there on composting and worm bins at growfoodwell.com, or you can just get on the email list and you can get free tips like this all the time. So I hope that generates some good ideas for your spring garden. Now get out there and grow some food.